Welcome back, everyone. Hope you had a good lunch. Before we commence the second session, on behalf of the organizers, we do apologize for the inconveniences caused by the rearrangement of the hall. As the program is very tight and we have a short turnaround time, we need to set the room ready for the Education Minister session and dialogue with Singapore's Prime Minister. We do appreciate your kind understanding. And now we shall move on to the next session of the panel discussion. And chairing this session is Ambassador C. Chakman, Adjunct Senior Fellow of ISAS and Senior Advisor, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Singapore. And I'll now pass the floor to Ambassador C.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Thank you very much. I think we're running a bit late time. This afternoon, we have three very eminent speakers and three very interesting topics. I think first we have Dr. Narayan. He is currently the visiting Senior Research Fellow in ISAS. Oh, okay, sorry. So I'll introduce briefly the three speakers. Dr. Narayan, he will speak on India and South Asia, recent trends in trade and investment flows and prospects for deeper economic integration. He was formerly very senior officials in various ministries, in petroleum, in others, revenue, and he was also the former economic advisor to the Prime Minister. And following that, we have a very interesting topic on Pakistan's strategic economic interests with India and Southeast Asia. Mr. Berkey himself occupied very senior positions in the World Bank, and he's now also currently the very senior fellow in ISAS, and he was the former finance minister of Pakistan in 1996 to 1997. And last but not least, a very important guest, Mr. Brooks and Whistler. He's the chairman of Southeast Asia of Goldman Sachs, and we talk on the topic, role of Singapore, India, and US business strategy for Asia. So without much ado, I will invite Dr. Narayan to speak on this topic. Dr. Narayan, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Ambassador C. Chakman. Post-lunch and my topic contains a lot of slides, so I think great opportunity to doze off if you want to, because it's kind of technical here. I'm supposed to be speaking on India and Southeast Asia, recent trends in trade and investment flows and prospects for deeper economic integration. So it's because of the title, I think I need to go into a little bit of depth on what's happening in the trade flows between the two regions, India and Southeast Asia. To start with, I think the first point is that trade has been growing between the two countries. And the rate of growth of trade has been 11.2% in the last decade. And if you just compare it with the 1993-2003 period and the period 2001 to 2010, you can see the rate of growth has actually doubled. That means there's much greater integration of trade with the South Asian region. FDI inflows, as calculated from ASEAN to India, were close to 18.3 billion. When I mention this figure, we must remember that there are a lot of Indian companies also who are sourcing Singapore as a source of finance for investment into India. So if it needs to be netted out to find out the total Singapore and ASEAN investment, but the total figures they are is quite substantial at 18.3 billion. Last year was a little bit of a blip, and the FDI inflow has dropped from 3.4 to 1.8 billion, and I think this is an area of some concern, and we can discuss this a little later. The most important development that has happened recently is the India-ASEAN regional framework agreement for a free trade area, and this has come into force on the 1st of January 2010, and of course it's one of the world's largest free trade area with a population of 1.8 billion and a combined GDP of 2.8 trillion. From all the Asian members, the trade relations between Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia and Thailand have been significant, whereas the others, Laos, Cambodia, Brunei and Vietnam, do not account for even 1% of the trade between the two regions. So this presentation focuses on the major partnerships. This is a fairly complicated graph, but if I can just draw your attention to the bullet points at the bottom, that perhaps would explain the graph a little better. The ASEAN countries, and this is from the World Development Indicators in the data bank of the World Bank. 2000 and 2009 were bad years for Southeast Asia, but average growth from 2003 to 2007 in the 6 countries was 6.1%, whereas in India we have been witnessing a consistent 8% growth during this period. And we do expect that ASEAN countries will on the average grow at a combined rate of about 6% until 2015. So it gives a great opportunities for greater integration of trade. Inflation, this is a comparison of inflation of the ASEAN countries. India is the black square one there. 1 minute. You can see that of the ASEAN countries, Cambodia is showing a very, very high level of inflation. And if you look at Singapore, Singapore is the lowest. In fact, very stable, 3.5–4% inflation. Even that is actually worrying Singaporeans, that 3.5–4%. But you can see that India is starting to live at a much higher rate of inflation of about 7–8%. But comparatively, you can see that within the ASEAN region, India is just above the median. Exchange rates, again, if you see the bottom one, the yellow one, you can see the golden one. You can see that both Malaysia as well as the light blue one, the Singapore, has been having very, very stable exchange rates for the last 8 to 10 years. Whereas in India, you can see that the situation has, I mean, this is an interesting graph because people do talk about the deterioration of the Indian rupee against the dollar. But I think this graph will point out that if you look at the long-term trend rates of the Indian rupee, we are not very far away from the long-term trend rates, even at 54, 55 rupees. And this is something I keep emphasizing. If you're looking at 60 rupees, you're looking at 64 rupees to the dollar, it is bad. But you're looking at 54, 55 rupees, it is okay. And you could see that the little dip there is in a way unusual to the long-term dip rate. So a price of 48, 49 rupees was unusual in 2009. India was kind of overvalued at that year, and we are getting back to normative values. And so I think over concerns about the Indian rupee, I think are not quite necessary. Trends in trade, again, you can just look at this as the total exports to ASEAN nations. And if you look at India's exports to the total exports to the rest of the world, you can see that still the ASEAN nations account for a comparatively very small percentage of the total trade. And of these, again, Singapore is substantial, and the others keep having a very, very small figures, and you go down to something like Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar, and you come to very, very small figures. If you look at exports from India, again you can see that the exports have been growing. I can't say have not been growing, but after 2007, 2008, the considerable increase that you saw from 2004, 5, 6, 7, and 8 and 9 has been a dip, but we hope that the export growth will continue after 2010. 2011, 12 figures are not yet available, of course, but we would continue to see this kind of a growth here. Imports from ASEAN nations, again a healthy growth. Again the dip in 2009 because of the global crisis, but followed by again going back to the 2008 growth figures and increasing beyond that. So again, you'd see that 15.12%, I mean, I would say the trade deficit actually has decreased with the ASEAN nations. If you come to Singapore, you can see the significant increases from 2001. If you're looking at a figure of 10,215, and you're looking now in 2008 at 97, you're looking at a 9 to 10-fold increase in those 7 or 8 years. Again, the 2009 dip is for obvious reasons, and again you can see the kind of growth that is happening. What are the kind of items that are getting imported? If you look at the colors, there's a lot of agriculture and allied products. There is a small percentage of handicrafts which is disappearing as you go on. There are chemicals and related products. There's leather. There are engineering products. And I think this is a point that my colleague Dr. Amitendra Palit made at a seminar yesterday, and that is that the quantity of engineering products which are integrating into Singapore and ASEAN, which in a way is an indicator of the way in which Indian manufacturing is starting to integrate with the global manufacturing chain, is clearly seen from these figures, and that you do see that products are getting added into global manufactured goods. So I think you are getting into a good system from India point of view, less of handicrafts, less of traditional item, more of the more modern items. I'll just run through for the other countries as well. Malaysia, you can see substantially smaller than Singapore, but again a healthy growth rate, but more or less stabilizing at about 38,893, 39,000. I mean, I would say $39 million, $392 million, I think. It is stabilizing at that rate. And similarly, you can see imports from Singapore, Malaysia also, not having that kind of a trend line that you have with Singapore. Just run through the others. That is Indonesia. The steep growth, you can see the steepest growth is happening in the imports from Indonesia. Obviously coal. India is becoming a major importer of Indonesian coal. And you can see that the trade balance with Indonesia is going to deteriorate because more and more coal is going to come in, and I think exports are not going to grow at the same pace. Thailand, okay, again, a gradual increase, continuous increase on both the sides, imports and exports. What's the point I am making? The point I am making is that the rate of growth from 2008, 9, 10 has been very significant. There was a dip in 2009. The sharp increases after 2010 will likely to continue 2011, 12 onwards. There's a decrease in trade deficit, which means India is trying to push more products into Southeast Asia. Product composition is changing. Product composition is changing from traditional goods to, I would use a loosely word, more modern goods, manufactured goods, petrochemicals, things like, I would say, petroleum products, etc. So there is a change in trend, increase in growth, and a sharper increase in growth of trade with ASEAN. Moving to the financial flows, you could see that the kind of financial flows to India from the ASEAN countries, obviously the biggest contributor is Singapore at 10 billion, followed by Indonesia, and the comparatively small numbers from the other countries. Coming to opportunities, these are kind of I would say this is what is the current situation. What's likely to happen as we go along? I think the most important one is as I mentioned earlier, the ASEAN-India Trade in Goods Agreement, which was signed in 2010. And what the main features of this agreement are that face reduction of import duties on Indian and ASEAN members countries' agriculture and non-agriculture product between January 2010 and January 2016. I think this is important to look at from a slightly different point of view. I think as we move forward, India is going to depend substantially on ASEAN for food products. For example, it's a very large importer of pulses from Myanmar. It's a very major importer, occasionally, I would say periodically, of rice from both Thailand and Myanmar as well. So as a source, and substantially, of course, palm oil from Malaysia. So as as India's food needs grow, India would be looking at ASEAN as a source of supply of primary products. And therefore, it makes sense for India to open up this area of primary products to the ASEAN countries for import, and that's what's been factored into this agreement. There's an agreement to eliminate tariff by 2013 under products under what is called normal track, and there are two normal tracks, normal track 1 and normal track 2, and these includes mineral fuels, chemical products, plastics, rubber, iron and steel, electrical equipment, transport and machinery. Again, if you look at it very carefully, look at the list carefully, I think India is looking at ASEAN slowly as a major supplier for its growth. There's a shortage of rubber is required here. Mineral products, coal is required here. So tariff reduction is in this agreement, of course it benefits the exporting country, but tariff reduction has been strategically arrived at to improve the opportunities for value additions in India. And I think this is a kind of a learning process in this agreement that India has achieved over the last 5 or 6 years in negotiating with trade agreements. 70% of the tariff lines fall under NT1, constitutive agriculture, marine and manufactured goods. 9% fall under NT2. The rest are 496 projects, which is a small list, which constitute an execution list, and which is about 9% of the total goods traded. Overall, AFTA is a trade liberalization of over 90% of the products traded between the two regions, and tariffs of over 4,000 product lines will be eliminated by 2016. Of course, there is some concern among Indian manufacturers here that this kind of elimination of tariffs would lead to, I would say, the local goods being overwhelmed by imported goods. But if you, in the balance, if you see as ASEAN as a source of good quality, primarily and secondary manufactured goods for the country, I think overall there's a lot of benefit in eliminating tariffs in this manner. I have a list of the kind of things that are getting imported here, and this is just to reinforce the point that there is a change in kind of a mindset of certainly the negotiators by and large has been a part of the government and earlier, and I have witnessed situations where Indian negotiators have been often been dragged, I would say, screaming and shouting to negotiation tables, not very willing to give up on tariffs and protection. But I do see that this particular agreement as a very, very welcome change in the attitude and a very welcome change of actually opening up trade with ASEAN. So I do strongly feel that this will result by 2015-2016 into a doubling, if not a tripling, of trade with ASEAN and a lot of internal flows which will add to value addition in the Indian economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Narayan, for the presentation on trade and investment trends between ASEAN and Singapore. I suggest that we'll allow the two other speakers to complete the presentation, then open the floor to Q&A. Next on my list is Mr. Shahid Berki, who will speak on a very interesting topic and not very common topic to be heard in India and Singapore, Pakistan's strategic equal interests with India and South Asia. Mr. Berki.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very grateful to the chairman of my institute to ask me to come to this and talk about a subject which probably doesn't really belong to this particular seminar. How does one introduce Pakistan into a discussion about ASEAN and India and China and so on and so forth? But I'll do my best, and I hope I can get you interested in thinking about looking at the West and not looking always at the East. But when Professor Tan Tai Yong announced this morning that the panel of strategic thinkers was going to be succeeded by a panel of economists, I knew it will happen. I knew that the hall will empty out. And so not many people are interested in hearing the advocates of the dreary and dismal science. So be it. We will try and make it a bit more interesting. I did come with a prepared statement, but when I began to hear the presentations, I decided to discard it and develop something entirely new, considering what I had already heard. So essentially what I am going to talk about are 5 things. Number 1, why introduce Pakistan into this equation which has the ASEAN and various ASEAN pluses in place. Second, something that I have been thinking about, working on, and publishing is if 21st century, as many people are saying, is going to be the Asian century, then what shape should it take, or what shape is it likely to take? Then my suggestion will be that perhaps it is not right to think about one Asia, 2 Asias. Perhaps the time has come to think of even more Asias. And if you do that, then you begin to talk about connectivity, and we heard some notions about connectivity in the earlier session. If you talk about connectivity, that's where Pakistan comes in. Pakistan comes in because I'm a bit surprised that in all the discussions that we have heard, in all the presentations that we have listened to, how little has been said about Asia's energy problem. Last night, as it happened, I was reading a report written by the World Bank, in which the World Bank uses what they call comparators to analyze the situation in India and Pakistan and a bunch of other countries. And they have come to the conclusion that India is by far the most stressed country when it comes to energy, with Pakistan a little behind. That surprised me. I thought Pakistan was more so than India. The numbers they use is that in India, the demand-supply gap is of the order of about 30%. In the case of Pakistan, it is of the order of about 22%. I say this because it gives me a reason to bring Pakistan into this discussion. Pakistan, at this point, is doing very, very poorly. It has been following a declining growth trend for the last 50 years, for the last a bit less than 50 years. Before that, and that's when I went to study economics outside Pakistan, and Pakistan then was being treated as a model of growth that other countries may well follow. The rates of growth in the 60s in Pakistan was of the order of about 7%. And then Pakistan went to war with India in 1965. And ever since then, the rate of growth has been declining. The trend has been declining. There have been spurts up and down, but essentially Pakistan has pursued a declining trend. And if you look at the trend, the broad trend line in India, it's moving in the opposite direction. So there is now a gap that has emerged between potential and achievement, which is very interesting to look at when you're doing this kind of analysis. Now, there was a bit of a discussion about Islamic stuff and its implications for India, Southeast Asia, and so on. Pakistan obviously is right in the epicenter of Islamic extremism. And those of us who've done some work in this area have come to the conclusion that unless economic side of this equation is looked at, unless the economy begins to grow, unless people are given jobs and so on, the attraction of these kinds of movements will probably become even stronger. There were references a number of times to the attack on the Indian Parliament, mention of Mumbai and so forth, and these were activities engineered by folks in Pakistan. So it is extremely important for all of Asia to see to it that Pakistan can join in several ways into the larger Asian context. And in that context, when you talk about the Asian century people, and we heard a bit about this morning, people begin to mention about essentially two Asias. There is a China-centered Asia and there's an India-centered Asia. And the question is whether the two would connect. I've written a few articles published in Singapore newspapers asking the question whether there will be convergence between these two Asias or a divergence. And I've come to the conclusion that it is more likely to be a divergence because these two Asias, one with China as the anchor economy, and the other with India as the anchor economy, are very, very different. Not only in terms of the rates of growth and so on, but the way the governments are managed, where the political system is run, where succession took place, the way minorities are looked after and so on and so forth. So it is going to be very difficult to bring these two Asias into one kind of a connected 5 minutes. I've just started. So the point I'm making is that if you broaden the scope and if you talk about something like 4 Asias, you talk about Central Asia, you talk about the Middle East, and you talk about India-focused Asia, China-focused Asia, then you have 4 Asias. And if you can be persuaded that energy is going to be a very big problem, then what could happen, what should happen, and what will perhaps happen is that there will be connectivity of India with various parts of Central Asia and with the Middle East through Pakistan. There will be connectivity of China through Pakistan with the Middle East. So connections, energy-related connections become extremely important, and Pakistan occupies the geographic space through which all these pipelines and energy grids and so forth will run. So this then is a way of not only of bringing Pakistan into Asia, but also making sure that one of the major problems that the Asian continent has, which is to meet its energy requirements so that the rates of growth that Asia should be achieving get to be achieved. This then brings me to my final point. What is it that needs to be done? Now, building pipelines, 2, 3, 4, 5 pipelines, all of them passing through Pakistan, but delivering energy to different parts of South Asia and East Asia and China and so on and so forth, and building integrated electricity grid systems. This will be a complex task. It has been done once before. Not many people will remember that in the 1960s, Pakistan and India concluded what's called the Indus Water Treaty. That was a treaty to divide the rivers of the Indus Basin between India and Pakistan. And to compensate Pakistan for the loss of water, a huge construction project was begun. It lasted for about 10 years, and in terms of today's dollars, cost about $30–40 billion. It was managed by the World Bank. It was a remarkable success, although India and Pakistan have had 2 wars since that particular treaty was signed. That treaty remained operational. So my view is that if something concrete is to be done in order to bring about connectivity related to energy, then I think we need to get together and develop a program for the building of pipelines for taking gas and petroleum products from surplus to deficit countries. And this will need money. Money can be had from three different sources. The usual source is the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. The second one is a very intriguing source. That is the new bank, which is going to be set up by the BRICS countries. It's going to be called BRICS Development Bank. It will be something like the Asian Development Bank. It will have an enormous amount of money, and this project could become one of the first it finances. And finally, the South Asian diaspora. Now, last year, Chairman Pillay held a very interesting conference in Singapore to discuss about South Asian diasporas. And I began to use some numbers, and I've done some more work since then. There are about 40 million South Asians outside their own country. And my estimate is that they earn every year something like $2 trillion, which is a lot of money, almost equal to, not quite, but almost equal to India's GDP. They save about $400 billion a year, and they obviously invest that savings. That should be tapped. It can only be tapped if there is somebody doing the tapping. And that's where Singapore comes in. Singapore has the financial structure, has the experience for building large projects, has the diasporas present, has been shy of doing these kinds of things. And so I think we should urge the Singaporeans to work with various countries that have gas and oil and those that don't have gas and oil to get together and put something like this in place and get it going. And this would be, I think, a tremendous initiative which could be taken by a small country which has tremendous reputation across the globe, is respected all over the place, and has the means to do it. So let me stop at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Berkey. Which comes follow up to my next speaker, Brooks and Whistler. He spent some years in Mumbai before moving to Singapore recently, so he's the best person to take about a very challenging topic, Singapore's role in India and US business strategy for Asia. Brooks, your floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the organizers for having me today. It is a true pleasure to come back with my Singapore hat on after having moved, after 5 wonderful years in Mumbai, to Singapore 18 months ago. So the topic today of the strategic, critical role that Singapore has for Indian corporates is one that is near and dear to my heart, having spent time in both locations. And I will focus on the India-Singapore connectivity and corridor. Many of the comments I'll make are relevant for U.S. businesses, which is also in the title of the panel. But for the purpose of today, this is important. And as with my fellow panelists, when we were given this post-lunch slot, I realized that you had to take a bit of a different approach to make sure that you all were engaged. And I took a page out of David Letterman's book, which is the top 10 list for the reasons that Singapore is an absolute critical location and piece of any strategy for India's corporate entities. And let me start. And I'll get through these quickly and hopefully give a bit of time back for my portion for the Q&A session, which I'm sure will be a lively one. The first, incredible India and uniquely Singaporean. There is no question that the relationship between these two countries, the corridor that I referred to, is alive and well and thriving. You saw in some of the earlier slides the FDI numbers, which have continued to soar. Singapore as a destination for India continues to be important. It's critical. As a trading partner, these roles have developed over time. And one thing that I've been struck by, having lived in Singapore now and been back to India almost on a monthly basis, if not more frequently, is the fact that now some 4,000 companies in Singapore founded by or of an Indian origin are now based in Singapore. That number is expected to go to over 6,000 at some point in the next couple of years. This corridor, and whether or not you take it on the air traffic front, there are 19 Singapore Airline flights a week now between my former hometown and my current hometown. And that is an exceptional increase for those of us plying those two markets over time. Number two, It goes without saying that from a Singapore standpoint, from political stability and regulatory stability, it is truly solid as a rock. Singapore is a place, and some of my comments today will be through the prism of our own experience at my firm, Goldman Sachs, having over the course of the last 18 months changed our strategy in Singapore to go from a regional office or a satellite office to a regional hub. And in the course of that time, doubling from 300 people to 650 people in Singapore in the last year. So I have lived this as the chairman of our Southeast Asia business as we've tried to really take a chance. And this political and economic stability is absolutely critical to this. It's important to note that this AAA rating for Singapore is unique around Asia. It makes it a very, very stable counterparty to be involved with. It's predictable. The government, the regulators, the people we deal with, it is a very open relationship. I was commenting to one of my fellow panelists earlier. I am constantly, in the last week I've been over to the MAS, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, 2 times in different capacities. This is an engaged government, engaging with businesses who want to come to Singapore. And we find that incredibly, incredibly important. And then transparency, I think that is something that absolutely is critical. In some surveys, the notion of it being the most transparent or at least corrupt, you name your thing, Singapore comes out at the most top of the list for Asian countries. Number 3, this competitiveness and pro-business environment. I think this can only be further emphasized here. This is a place that wants to attract Indian businesses and has had a success rate in doing so and will continue to do so. It is truly all about business. The skilled workforce, we have found as we have expanded greatly and tapped this local market, you have a government in Singapore that is very focused on talent development. I know that'll be a topic in the next education minister talk as well as when the PM is here. But talent is a key piece of Singapore. It has been in the strategy and it is there waiting for you. The infrastructure, I think, is critical. We opened a second building 18 months ago to bring this large group of people in that we began moving from around the region and around the world. This building was up quickly. It was turned over quickly. It has everything we need and an incredibly smooth experience. From a financial center standpoint, number 4, Singapore is truly a premier financial center. It is not without competition in the region. I was on a panel in Mumbai in 2007 with the finance minister at that time on Mumbai as a financial center, Dubai, Shanghai, you name it. Everybody is chasing this same holy grail of being a financial center in Asia. Singapore is doing all it can to stay out in front of that race. The Singapore Stock Exchange, where we obviously are a participant, has a 40% of its listings are foreign companies that have come to Singapore, and they're always looking for and attracting more. It's a large REIT market for the real estate businesses in Asia, which I think is important. Again, thinking of ways to compete strategically relevant, again, to India. And clearly a very important market on the private wealth management standpoint for all of Southeast Asia and increasingly the world as private wealth people and their funds come into that market. Number 5, taxes, a big topic in this country, currently a big topic everywhere all the time, but taxes in Singapore, I would say taxes simplified. It is a place where from a personal tax rate, a corporate tax rate, tax treaties with some 64 or 65 other countries, it is straightforward, and we understand and businesses understand what they are getting into. From a location standpoint, as with everything, it is location, 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 my number 6 point. And I think it's highlighted in the discussion today, the very interesting previous discussion on the role of Pakistan and others in this entire region and tapping into ASEAN. Singapore's role historically is very clear. We're all familiar with that history. But we've found in running our Southeast Asian ASEAN business out of Singapore is that connectivity, and Singapore is a jumping off point now to Indonesia, to Malaysia, to a Thailand that is firing, to the Philippines that is having a terrific couple of years in a row now. These are all markets that Singapore is very useful for as a hub. Number 7, and this is important because as Indian corporates want to set up additional businesses in Singapore and bring people there, it is a highly, highly livable city. I have 3 young daughters who loved Mumbai. They had a terrific time. They grew up in Mumbai. And Singapore has been a very easy transition for them. They're thankfully back in India often. They haven't lost their love for this country. But I will tell you, whether or not it's schools, it's apartments, it's things that people need to live comfortably, we have no problem attracting our people from around the world to Singapore to live there and be a part of it. And the government, I think, is extremely aggressive about going after people, and they want senior people to come there, to run businesses, to set up businesses, which is critical. just a couple others rounding out the list. I think this notion of talent, I want to come back to it. There's a total focus, number 8, total focus on talent development. Singapore has obviously grown enormously from a population standpoint over the course of the last several years, but underlying the Singapore success story has been its incredible workforce throughout the years that has grown in different areas, then transformed itself as the world markets have changed and the needs have changed. In a meeting that we just had this week with our own head of human capital management in the region, we think very broadly, as the Singaporeans do, about ways to not only promote Singaporean talent within our own organization around the world, but attract talent back to Singapore. But I will tell you, and I promise you, you will hear about this over the course of the next couple of speeches. Last Friday, I was at the opening of the Yale NUS liberal arts school with the Prime Minister. This is an incredible development for Singapore, the first true liberal arts college in Singapore, the first time that Yale has opened up a branch, if you will, or an outpost around the world in its 300-year history. So this focus on education, which is obviously the core pillar of talent, is very, very real and very much front of mind. Number 9, trust. This is a place where your IP is safe. It's focused on in everything we do, whether it's financial transactions, if you're in the IT business, your IP, as I mentioned, there's a trustworthy element to this, which I think is a key driver and a key thing. And then finally, the relentless pursuit of knowledge is number 10. And this ties a lot of the previous points together. It's education, it's talent, but it is the notion of figuring out what Singapore is competitive advantages on the R&D front, on the industry front, and thinking through that over time and staying in front of it. And it's exciting to watch, and it's going to be exciting to watch in the future. So it is indeed, if you run through these top 10, it's an absolutely critical place for people to consider having their Southeast Asian hub, their Asian hub, and certainly from an Indian standpoint, a corridor that is already well traveled, and there is no doubt driven by natural resources, driven by people flows, will be an even more active corridor in the future. I would be remiss if I didn't have a similar list, and I will not bore you with a top 10 list on challenges for Singapore, but let me leave you with 5, just to promote thoughts and discussion in the panel discussion. Number 1, demographic challenges. No question, this is an aging population. The notion of bringing in talents and bringing in workers is obviously top of mind and top of political mind in Singapore as well. And that's not unique around the region. It's not, but it's certainly something that's focused on in Singapore. The growing economic and social spread within Singapore. It's again a topic around the region, but clearly Singapore is not spared that issue. This competition I mentioned, number 3, with other financial centers. Like every single listing, every single headquarters attracting pitch that goes on, there is someone else, Hong Kong, otherwise competing against Singapore. You've got to be out in front. And that actually, from the standpoint of people thinking about moving businesses there, is a great development in some ways, because it keeps everybody sharp and keeps you focused on where you're best placing your people. On the talent point, I think in continuing to develop local talent, there is this notion of promoting local talent, getting them to places they should be through the organization. There are still places where it's tough to find people for certain parts of our organization locally that we have to go outside of Singapore to do. And I know, having been in many discussions and on several panels on this topic and on some committees around this, that there's a lot of thought being done as a way of using the educational system to build capacity and build talent, certainly in the financial services businesses going forward. And lastly, infrastructure. There is no question that whether or not it's transportation, with a population of 5 million people now and more cars on the road, transportation is an issue, just like it is in India. Hospitals, other pieces of this are there. You always think about Singapore as being out in front of the infrastructure standpoint, and they certainly are. Everybody that's going in and out of Changi on a regular basis knows that, but there are certainly things to work on. So that's my top 10 pro and top 5 to think about, but I thank you, and it's great to be back in India.
Thank you, Brooks. Please give us about 12 minutes for question and answer. You could either address your question to specific panelists or to the panel as a whole. Please introduce yourself when you raise a question. And please keep the question simple and straightforward, because there are only 10 minutes time. Yeah.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Tanvi Ratna. I'm a student at Georgetown University, and I'm with the Ministry of External Affairs China desk. I had a question for Mr. Burki. You spoke about the connectivity that Pakistan brings for energy, and that's exactly why the TAPI pipeline was signed recently. My question to you is, what can an outside country do to encourage this kind of connectivity? I mean, you have India and Singapore in this forum, and other countries who would be interested in building more pipelines from Central Asia through Pakistan. But what kind of levers can they pull to get Pakistan more engaged in this game? And my other question is to Mr. Brooks. You spoke about stability in Singapore, and you spoke about attracting expats to Singapore. But in the last election there was a lot of resentment amongst the local population against expats in Singapore. And that was a big platform that was used for a lot of opposition candidates to come to power. So how stable do you see the situation being in the future? Thanks.
The pipelines that are being actively talked about, there are three of them. There is Iran, Pakistan, India pipeline. It's called IPI. It was virtually on the go, but then India pulled out of it. My guess is because of the American pressure, that Americans don't want at this point Iran to become involved in any kind of multi-country operation. The second one, which now is much more advanced, is called TAPI. That is Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. And here you have two banks very closely involved with it. Asian Development Bank, which has done a lot of work, and the World Bank has also expressed an interest in this. There has been conclusion of an agreement on transit fees between Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, and India is likely to join in. The third pipeline, at least from my perspective, is possibly the most interesting. And this one was floated by the Japanese, and it happened when I was looking after China at the World Bank. They would like a pipeline which would bring gas from Qatar and take it through Pakistan to western China and to the eastern coast of China, where they will set up a very large liquefaction plant for export to Tokyo, to Japan. And the economics that I saw on this was very, very good. It saves Japan an enormous amount of money by way of transport to get it shipped across this. The main problem over there was that this pipeline will cross about 5 countries, and somebody like the World Bank will have to give guarantee for this. There are other projects that are being talked about. India has begun work on connecting Bathinda refinery, which was built by the private sector, with Pakistan. It's a 50-kilometer pipeline which will bring in petroleum products. There is some talk about Reliance Industries creating a very large storage facility in the depleted salt mines of Pakistan, and then using a pipeline to take the stored crude oil to the refineries in Rajasthan. That's essentially the point, is that once you get started along these lines, once countries develop confidence that this is the sort of thing that can be done, there is no reason why this should not happen, especially when the countries that I'm talking about, India and Pakistan in particular, are really now being constrained by not having ability to get the energy that they need.
Brooks, a
Very quick on the talent point.
There are few Singaporeans here can be very frank about it.
Absolutely. I love interesting elections. I was a UN election officer at one point, and last 2 elections in Singapore last year were fascinating for the exact reasons you pointed out. I do want to just clarify, I think the notion of expat, that is a broad term, and I think you need to be a little bit careful with kind of using that as a blanket across and how the Singaporeans are thinking about it, and certainly from a government standpoint. I think there is still a real acceptance and desire and willingness to bring certain skill sets into Singapore at the senior level where you can help develop local talent in certain places. There is no question that where there are jobs and functions that could be facilitated by Singaporean citizens, that there's a real desire to fill those first there. And so even in our own business, there's issues of who we think about bringing in from outside in our system and how we develop our local talent as well. Obviously, we're in the business of localizing all of our businesses around the world. And if you look at our incoming class, like other organizations there, most of them are Singaporeans from Singaporean schools for that reason.
Other questions, please? Yes, this gentleman here. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Godwin Lim. I'm the President and CEO of Going Group. My questions to the panel. As PM Lee has quoted on the 9th of July itself, talking about the values and transparencies of the new generation itself,
Can you please go to a question quickly because we
yes,
have 6
the
minutes.
question is like the values and the of India itself. Do you think is changing with time itself that that might be the one of the factors that determine the economic future of India itself?
Thank you. I think, Dr. Narayan, you're the best person to answer this question. Indian values and how to affect the future growth.
I think this is a bit of a large question, but if you're taking in terms of values, in terms of our expectations of economic well-being, of materialistic success, of expectations of integration with the rest of the world, of doing things which people in the rest of the world is doing, the answer is certainly yes. That doesn't mean that cultural values have necessarily changed, that basic Indian values, the home values or domestic values have changed. But I think there is an increasing recognition, especially in the last 15 or 20 years, of the need to integrate with the rest of the world. Yeah.
Thank you. Next question. Oh, yes, that gentleman at the far back, please.
My name is Janak Tilsania, and I'm a retired investment manager. For highly indebted Western countries, there are only a few ways to get out of it. Either you reignite growth or inflation, neither of which seems to be happening, or you default, which is the last option, or you have financial repression, which is being done, but can't solve the problem. So there is a temptation to resort to competitive devaluation and concurrent pressure to revalue certain currencies. How do you view that scenario?
Does it refer to any particular country or you?
I think the US in particular.
In US, I think perhaps in the context may not be.
Okay,
for this
fair enough.
forum. Yeah, I think, unless any comments, Narayan? Yeah, I think, not perhaps on this pattern, some other time, okay, sorry. Yeah, the lady, please.
Hi, my name is Deepanjali. I was formerly a business journalist and I'm a communication specialist now. My question is to Mr. Brooks with regard to the title of your presentation itself, the role of Singapore in taking this process forward. With regard to what you mentioned, which we all know about, the almost enviable manner in which Singapore's ministry is able to function and encourage business. Do you think there is a scope for India learning from these processes, perhaps replicating something, or do you think that it's inherently inimical to the Indian system?
Brooks? I think this is the last question we have.
Yeah.
Brooks? Yeah.
I think, and I'll just put it in the context of financial centers as an example. It's a broad question, but it's a fair one. I think as you think about competitive financial centers, whether it's Singapore, if it's Mumbai thinking about it, or any other cities that I mentioned or that are after this, there's clear learning from each, and this is the race to the top. And you figure out what people are doing well and see if there's elements of that make sense to do in your own situation. And I think that's what you're seeing as this plays out across the region and across the world from a financial center standpoint. You can certainly take that same argument and other discussion to multiple topics, which are certainly the topic for another panel.
I will not impose, but I'm going to Dr. Narayan will answer the question. Okay, we leave it at that. I think perhaps quite a number of participants want to ask questions. We are very prominent panelists, but because we're running short of time, I would like to close the session and like to invite all of you to show your appreciation to the panelists.
Thank you, everyone, for your invigorated discussion. And ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of the panel discussion. And now I would like to invite everyone to a short tea break at the Mumtaz Hall, which is just next to this function room. If you're attending the special address by Minister Heng Swee Keat, Minister for Education Singapore, and the dialogue session with Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, we greatly appreciate your cooperation to be seated back in the hall by 3:20 p.m. In the meantime, please enjoy your tea break.